Good evening all, and welcome. Before the video begins, I'd like to thank Raven Reads for joining us today with these 10 followed home stories. Be sure to check out her channel straight after this video, and you'll be able to find the link at the end or in the description. Don't forget, we are trying to hit that 1,000 comment milestone, so be sure to drop yours in nice and early before you go over and check her out. But anyway, with that being said, it's time to get comfortable and let the darkness take control. Okay, so there are a few things which I would like to clarify before we get started. 1. I come from a place that has had, and still has to this day, some serious problems with violence towards women and kidnapping of young women, and is sadly something that happens very often. 2. Although I lived all my life in a decent area, some of the other areas weren't so decent, so I kind of learnt how to avoid problems. With this in mind, let's get into the story. So it's been a while since I moved to another country, where I had been feeling safe for the past 2 or 3 years, and my family decided that it was finally time to pay me a visit in my new home. The differences between environments were so great that they were all perplexed and amazed about doing things that would be otherwise considered normal to many, like going out at late hours of the night. During their stay, I suggested we should all go to the city centre, and we did. It was such a lovely thing. The weather was nice, we had dinner at a good restaurant, and took some pictures. But they began to get tired, so we started to make our way home. It wasn't even 11 PM yet, but it had been a long day of going around. I was talking to my parents as I led the group back, when I noticed a couple of men coming on the opposite direction, with cell phones up, like they were taking a video. I ignored it and kept moving, thinking that they were just tourists. I got my chills when I noticed that the guys are only 1 block away from when I first saw them, and they were standing just a few meters away from us. These guys had gone back on their steps somehow, and were now very near, and not 5 minutes after, I saw them. They were looking at me intently, and even followed me with their eyes. My first reaction was to ignore them, pretend that I didn't see them as to not alert my family, because it so happened to be that some of my family are quite dramatic, and would just blow things out of proportions. So I carried on, and these guys did too, even trying to walk as closely as possible to be making eye contact with me. I begin to use my father to hide from their view, as he's tall, chubby, and always has the appearance of being a frightening person, but he's pretty chill unless provoked. For a time this worked, and the guys kept their distance, but when we arrived to the metro it got creepier still. One of the guys found his way to sneak around to be one person behind my dad on the electric stairs, and tried to walk past him, even attempting to keep making eye contact. Then I noticed that his hands never left his face, covering his mouth for no reason. The other guy was far behind, but I managed to keep myself out of view, and luckily, whoever that was in front of the guy pushed him backwards. I don't know how, but we managed to lose them in between the crowd, but not before I'd get one last glance at them, saying something to each other and pointing to me with their fingers. I hope to never meet those creeps again.
For this to make sense, I have to give a brief history on my upbringing. My mom left when I was 4, and my brother was 2. My dad took on full custody, and we ended up moving in with my grandparents. I'd talk to my mother on the phone occasionally, and we'd see her for a few days every 1 to 2 years. When I was 13, Dad moved us into our own home, and Mom decided she was going to move back. At At the time, I had it in my head that it would be a Gilmore Girls kind of relationship. I even binge-watched as many episodes as I could in preparation. When she got into town, though, it didn't take me long to realize that our relationship would be anything but. Mom would drink while abusing her prescriptions of benzodiazepines. She'd go out all night, leaving me awake until, or if, she got back safe. When I confronted her, she would threaten to leave us again. I'd come home from school to find her intoxicated with bottles of wine next to her limp body. I don't remember when exactly, but it couldn't have been more than a year before she finally did leave. Given the circumstances of her behavior, it was probably for the best. What you gonna do? I could go on, but this story isn't about her. It's just a coincidental outcome of an unfortunate circumstance. I live in Florida. More specifically, tourist friggin' city. Well, the outskirts. You can imagine the dangers that look around you in the outskirts of a beautiful city. Walking alone at night was something I was cautious about, yet fearless of. Even when the sharks were out, I walked confidently. Sharks are what I used to call predators. They'd prey on you in an obvious fashion. When I'd walk down one of our main roads at night, they'd follow you. And the only way you'd be able to tell it was a shark was if they turned around and continued to circle until you either weren't in view or made it to the store across the busy road. In hindsight, the red flags were painfully obvious to just how dangerous they were. The sharks were always watching, and I was an easy target. One night, I caught my brother trying to sneak out. He was 12 at the time and wanted to go to the beach in a state of painful nostalgia. The memorable nights with Mom before our image of her completely diminished. "I'm going to go no matter what," he said. I couldn't let him go alone, and I didn't have time to wake Dad up before he was outside and I was following. For good measure, I grabbed a random screwdriver sitting outside. The ride on our bikes to the beach was pretty uneventful, and I hardly remember the beach itself. We snuck into one of the accesses that had closed hours ago, stayed for a while, shared stories about Mom, and went back to our bicycles. The ride back took a different turn on the same road. Around 2 a.m. Sharks are always lurking, and the dangerous ones don't live in the water. As soon as I got on the main road home, a car began to follow us. I warned my brother and told him to take a swift turn down one of the back roads. The 4-door sedan casually followed. 2:30 a.m. Austin, my brother, dropped his bike in the yard of one of my friends' house, jumping over their backyard fence. This was just in time for the car to turn and see me as I ran into the dark corner of their small patio, dropping the screwdriver I had taken just in case. I sat there with knees tucked into my chest, as still as a statue. The car was still stopped in the road facing the house. I didn't move for what seemed like minutes, but in all likelihood it had only been seconds. The car flashed their headlights on me. On, off. On, off. They say that adrenaline gives you extra human strength. You turn into a superhero in a sense. I wasn't a superhero, but it was the biggest rush I had ever felt. I could hear my grandmother telling me to scream as loud as I could if I was ever in a situation similar to this. Pouncing up from my crippling fear, I began hitting the door. I heard the car door open and heavy footsteps bear towards me. I screamed and hit the door as loud and hard as I could, through the otherwise dark, quiet neighborhood. I saw his shadow, but I didn't dare look back. The door swung open, and a boy a few years older than me answers, shocked. His eyes widen as he looks behind me, grabs my arm, and pulls me inside. "Get in." His mother comes out, arms folded and rubbing her eyes. "What happened?" she asked. This girl was pounding on the door for help, so I opened it. There was a man right behind her. He was reaching out to grab her until I pulled her in, and then he ran back to his car and left. 3 a.m. She lectured us about being out so late and what could have happened. Her advice did not fall on deaf ears. To this day, there's 2 things I won't do at night: swim and walk outside alone.
I'm 31 now, but was a teen when I was walking home one sunny day. It was winter, but winter in Florida is just a nice cool breeze. I remember holding a Tupperware in my hand that is still hot, containing pasta and broccoli that my grandma had just made. It was so cool living 1 block away from my grandma, because a quick 10-minute walk meant I got some really good leftovers. In between my house and her house was a patch of woods, but thorns and thickets prevented me from taking a shortcut through them. I remember looking down at the sidewalk just as I reached the middle of the patch of woods to my right. I heard someone ask, "Hey, where are you going?" I looked up, and to my left, towards the road, a thin man in a white van with his window rolled down smiled at me. He was driving in the opposite direction of the way I was walking. I simply said, "Home," and continued to walk. He started to say, "Hey, hey," so I looked back to see him hanging out of his driver window. "I'll give you a ride home. Come here," he says. I kept walking and loudly say, "No thanks." I stopped and turned around when I heard him drive away. I began walking again, creeped out, wishing that the woods didn't run long next to the sidewalk. I remember wishing I were home already. I was super alert, now hearing every critter in the brush to my right, the rustling leaves and stuff scurrying about. I pick up the pace, reminding myself that those woods were packed with lizards. I said to myself out loud, "It's just lizards running around, silly." But when I hear a vehicle coming up behind me, out of fear I look back, and to my horror, it's the same white van with the man smiling. The van slows down next to me, and a big, angry-looking man flung open the side door and jumped out. I turned to my right and began running as fast as I could into the woods. I was jumping over bushes and long vines, clenching my grandma's Tupperware for dear life. I looked back once, and the thick brush of the woods was slowing down the big man. I knew just going straight, I would reach my backyard, guarded by a chain-link fence. I remember the thorns and sticks slicing my skin, but I couldn't feel the pain. I just kept thinking, run. Once I reached the fence, I chucked the Tupperware and hoisted myself over, ripping my jeans and face-planted the ground on the other side with a loud thud. I ran onto my porch and began banging the back door. My dad let me in, and I'm literally panicking, covered in dirt and cuts, trying to lock the back door. I felt safe to be back home with my dad and our Rottweilers. He sat me down and started questioning me, and immediately called the cops. The 2 cops arrived and took a report, and they said, "Nothing like that's ever happened in my area before," and one of them even told me that lying was against the law. I remember they left, and my dad swore he believed me, and I could sleep in his room that night if I wanted. I remember feeling really sad and frustrated about not being believed and going to his bed without even eating the pasta with broccoli. It was hard to sleep or go anywhere for months after that, because I was scared the men were still out there. My dad ended getting me a cell phone and installing an alarm system to help me feel safe. I still have issues being alone to this day. To the men that tried to get me, let's never meet again.
This was about 10 years ago, but I remember it clearly. At the time, I was working swing shift, so I would get off of work downtown at midnight and had to wait 30 minutes for a bus, which took an additional 30 minutes to get to the stop closest to my house, which was a little under a mile away. I rode this bus every night, and it was usually fairly empty aside from myself and a few other people getting off retail jobs who I'd see pretty often. This happened during the holidays, so stores were open super late, and the closing employees rode my bus. But I was the last stop on the line, and I was usually the last person on the bus. This night, the same people as always got on the bus and got off at their regular stops. The second to last stop, I noticed that another guy was still on the bus, a guy that I had never seen before, and I saw that he was watching me. I was 18 years old at the time, dressed in sort of junky clothes. I worked at a homeless shelter, so never dressed up nice or anything, but still occasionally drew the attention of creeps on the bus because I was a girl alone late at night. Whatever, I thought to myself. I'd usually just tell creepy guys to get lost, and at the very worst they'd call me names, and that was the end of that. By 18, I'd dealt with it plenty of times, so I wasn't particularly upset by this. But the creepy guy was sort of different. He was an overweight Middle Eastern guy dressed in a knit sweater, slacks, and wire-frame glasses. Didn't say a word the entire time we were on the bus, just stared, never breaking his gaze, transfixed on me. Finally, we got to my stop, the last stop, and he was still sitting in the back of the bus, watching me as I got off. I thanked the bus driver, got off, and realized that the dude was still on the bus. I started walking up the hill to my house like I always do, and I noticed that the bus was still sitting at the stop instead of pulling out and putting on its two-terminal sign like it normally did. Weird, sure, but I kept walking. I'd made it about 500 feet when I heard the bus pull out and drive off. And then I heard someone running up behind me. Without even looking back, I knew it was the guy from the bus. He was maybe 50 feet behind me at this point, but I could hear him heaving to catch his breath, and he yelled out, "Princess, please wait." And of course I didn't wait. I just kept going. But he didn't stop. He kept yelling, "Please, please, princess. I want to make love to you. I have money. Please, I will pay you." I didn't stop walking. I didn't want to make eye contact or acknowledge him. But I'm also walking down a dark street with no cars and no people, and he's hot on my tail, but can't keep up with me and seems pretty winded. By the time I made it down the block, he was yelling at the top of his lungs, "Princess, princess, please let me make love to you. I will pay you. Just stop, princess. Please, please." And started sobbing, absolutely wailing, all the while yelling that he wanted to make love to me and that he would pay me for it and calling me a princess. He wouldn't stop sobbing, and he was so loud I'm surprised he didn't wake up anyone in the neighborhood. At this point, he's still about 50 feet behind me and crying. I was 5 blocks from my house and did not want to let the guy know where I lived, so I decided to call 911. He kept loudly crying and sobbing and pleading to me. I let the dispatcher know that some guy was following me and propositioning me and crying, and she could hear him sobbing in the background and said a deputy would be there soon. I live in a really skinny strip in an unincorporated part of the county between 2 cities with their own police departments, so the response times weren't too bad. I yelled at the guy, "I just called the cops, so leave me alone." And he just stopped. Stood there, sobbing. I keep walking, but slowly, since I'm so close to my house. A couple minutes pass, and there are lights. A sheriff was coming down the street, and when I turned around, the crying guy was nowhere to be found. The officer asked if I wanted him to go look for him or if I just wanted a ride home. I didn't ever want to deal with that guy again, so I just accepted the ride and asked him to check the area out around my house after he dropped me off, since it's pretty unusual to see an overweight guy in a sweater and slacks wandering around crying at 1:30 in the morning. I have no idea if they found him. No idea what would have happened if they did. since I'm not sure if anything he did was actually illegal or just really creepy. Needless to say, I deadbolted my house and stayed up all night talking to a friend in a different time zone until it was morning. Guy from the bus? Let's not meet again.
This happened last year. Where I used to work, me and my friend would always go to Denny's on Friday and get a milkshake to celebrate the beginning of the weekend. We leave work in separate cars, as we go our separate ways after our milkshakes. I pull in first to the parking lot, and my friend follows. We park on the side of the building, and there's a guy somewhere between the ages of 20 to 35. He was wearing a Chicago Bears beanie hat, and he was just standing there, seeming to be just loitering, just watching the cars go by, smoking a cigarette. I thought nothing of it, as maybe he was waiting for someone, or was just about to leave. Anyway, me and my friend go in and have our milkshakes. Fast forward 20 minutes, and we wrap up and leave. We both smoke a cigarette in the parking lot, and we go back into our own cars and leave. I get home 20 minutes later, because that's how far away I live from Denny's. I wake up about half hour later, so 1 a.m., and my dogs are barking like crazy while jumping up by the front window of my house, the window that faces the driveway. I look out the window, and the trunk of my car is open. So I go outside to further investigate what the hell is going on. There in the snow are footprints, and a red Chicago Bears beanie. My dash and fuse box panel under the steering wheel were all open, and some wires were cut. There was also a metal shim stuck in the ignition. I call the cops, and they fill out a report. They say that it looked like someone tried stealing my car by hot wiring it. The random guy from Denny's managed to ride 20 minutes home with me in the back of my car, without me ever even knowing he was riding with me. And then, he proceeded to try and steal my car. I'm not sure if they ever found the guy.
When I was around 10 or 11, I was riding my bike in the industrial park that was connected to my neighborhood. The area was full of businesses like auto body shops and moving services, things that need a headquarter but don't need to attract customers. It was an unpopular area, but I knew every street, alley, and secret path through the buildings that there was to know. I'd been riding there since I was 6. On this summer day, I was riding at a casual pace compared to my usual Tour de France speeds. Due to the recent heat wave, no one was in sight, and I had yet to see a car on the street. I went through my usual route, which took me a little longer than usual in the July sun. I was working up a sweat and realized that I should have brought a bottle of water. I heard a car approaching me from my rear and instinctively turned around to see a silver Chevy Malibu with a middle-aged man driving. I pulled to the right and allowed the man to pass. I noticed, however, that as he drove by, he was staring at me intently. It was odd, but nothing that raised any red flags. I continued to sit on my bike as he passed and drove to the intersection that was 100 or so feet away with a stop sign. He stayed there for a while, and again, I wasn't taking note of it as I caught up to the halted vehicle. As I stopped and checked for oncoming traffic, the man honked his car horn. It startled me, so I flipped around to see what the commotion was. The man had rolled down his window and was smiling at me. I gave a kind of nod to him and tried to turn away from the car. Immediately, the thousands of stranger danger warnings that had been drilled into my head since preschool began to shout at me. As I began to pedal, the man shouted, "Wait!" I stopped my bike, already a little on edge, and turned around. "Can I help you?" I asked. He paused for a moment, still smiling at me intently before continuing. "Awful hot out. Don't you go and get heat stroke." I half smiled, still a little nervous about the encounter. Yeah, thanks. I could use some water, but I'll be fine. Immediately, I realized that I should not have said that. Well, hop inside, he said. I've got this AC pumping 60 degrees. Air feels fine. The look on his face suddenly looked a lot less menacing to me. He reminded me of my grandpa, full of hospitality and always trying to help others out. Part of me wanted so badly to join him in that car. I have no idea why now. Looking back at the situation, it would have been the stupidest mistake of my life. No, I said, I'm fine, thanks. He tried to continue protesting, but I pedaled off into the street. As I was riding off, I realized that he was probably just a nice old man trying to help out a youth. I felt guilty for just driving off like that on him, but that's not where the story ends. I continue to ponder these ideas in my head as I ride. I turn onto another street to my left, riding a little bit faster. I reach another intersection, but before I turn, I take a shoulder check and see that the man's silver Malibu is about 75 feet away from me and slowly creeping toward me. It was not a regular driving speed. It was a crawl that only meant one thing to me. He was following me, and in that instant, a voice in my head shouted, "Ride," and I was off to the races. Every day I rode my bike down that street, but today it was boiling and it didn't make a bit of difference. I went faster than I'd ever gone before. I raced down the street in what seemed like a half a second. I was at the intersection at the other end. I stopped and took a momentary head check to see if he was still behind me. The man's car was bearing down the street at least 35 miles an hour towards me. Without waiting, I took off. I felt as if my life was in immediate danger as I sped down another street. My bike was no match to his car, and soon it was on my tail. I could hear his engine revving as he stepped on the gas and then braked so he didn't hit me. He honked his horn at me in yet another attempt to get me to pull over. I turned back to see that the once pleasant and nice man's face contorted with a look of genuine, indescribable rage that I have yet to see again on any human's face. Suddenly, my escape route became clear. I once again heard the voice in my head shout, "Alleys, idiot!" I turned to my right, speeding down the road to see an opening between two businesses. I pulled my bike into the lot faster than I had ever gone before. The space between them was narrow, and I was going far too fast to be safe. I was lucky, though, and I made it. But the danger was not over. I followed onto the back lot of the business, going about 40. I sped through the small path that I had blazed 1,000 times before, but never at speeds like this. I cut through the small path sidewalks and trails. I was now about 100 feet from the spot that I had entered, and I finally looked back to the opening. Nothing. I kept going quickly, taking a glance at the road in between two converging buildings, no car parallel to me. It was when doing this that I did notice the slightly inclined bump that the second lot presented. Going at my speed, it would have been impossible to miss, even if I had seen it. Next thing I knew, I was over my handlebars in the air. Then wham! Sliding across the concrete pavement on my face. I slid for what seemed like a good 10 seconds. I had laid there for a second as the lights and colors blurred my vision. This did not affect me. I hopped to my feet immediately and was startled by another voice. "Whoa, take it easy, little dude." My head snapped to the sound. Two familiar men in lawn chairs were sitting outside an open garage door to an auto repair business. I had never talked to them, but it seemed like daily I would pass the garage on my route, and oftentimes the men who were sitting there would cheer me on as I passed. I didn't know them, but it was like seeing your family for the first time in a year. I sighed with instant relief at their snickering faces. I walked towards them, strong at first, and then I stumbled and fell at their feet. The laughter was immediately wiped as they saw the emotions come across my face. As I explained the story to them and my adrenaline rush wore off, The pain came in like nothing I'd ever felt in my life. Searing pain that made me cry instantly as the wave of emotions hit me. They called my dad, who raced to pick me up and took me to the hospital. My dad helped me file a report on it, but nothing came of it. I left later with a cast on my arm and a whole lot of stitches. I still have a scar on my face from where I made the first touchdown. I can't help but thinking in the end, what would have happened if I had gotten into that car? The only thing I can go by was the look on that man's face. It was a look of pure evil and hatred. I might not be writing the story out if I had. If you have kids, or if you ever will, don't let them go out without a reminder of how serious strangers can be. My mother's badgering saved my life.
This happened about 3 years ago, but I honestly thought nothing of it, until a friend told me a similar story and got me quite upset about it. It got me thinking about my own experience, and I realized I may have escaped a dangerous situation out of pure luck and stubbornness. So way back 3 years ago, I had started working at a little food truck type business that sat outside a local Lowe's. I was in college, and the owner was really cool about working around my schedule and letting me do homework on my shift. My mum and I both had jobs, but only one car. Usually our schedules didn't cross too much, so only having one car wasn't that much of a problem. However, that day, our schedules crossed over in a really weird way. Well, my brother and sister-in-law live about 5 minutes down the road from where I work. They were out of town for the weekend, but told me I could stay the night at their place and walk to work the next day. That day was crazy hot, but I was pretty used to the heat because the little shop I worked in could get up to 100 degrees easily. Anyway, the road they lived on didn't have any sidewalks, so I had to just walk through people's front yards so that I wouldn't get hit by cars. I was about halfway to my destination when this fancy-ass white SUV pulled up close to me, and this older guy in his 40s rolled down his window and called out to me, "Hey there, you need a ride?" Having not really been paying attention, I automatically said, "No thank you." I don't know why, but that's always my automatic reaction to when someone catches me off guard with a question. "Are you sure? It's really hot out here, and a young girl like you shouldn't be walking on dangerous roads like this." Somewhere in the back of my mind, an alarm started going off. But I like to think the best of people, so I didn't pay it much attention. "No, it's okay," I said. "I'm just going to the Walmart." The Walmart was actually on the opposite side of the shopping area from my work. I don't know why I lied, but for some reason, I didn't want to tell him where I was actually going. I figured that it would be the end of it, and just continued walking. "It's not a problem," he insisted, keeping pace with me in his car. "Just hop in. It's not out of my way." "No, really, I'm good. I like walking." At this point, the guy started to get frustrated. He scowled at me and said something like, "I'm just trying to be a nice guy." And that's when he noticed more cars behind him and must have realized he was holding up traffic, because he gave me one final scowl, growled, "Whatever," and zoomed off. Now, I don't like to be a suspicious person, but whether this guy was a legitimately harmless person or had something more sinister in mind, I don't know. But nonetheless, pushy guy in the fancy SUV, let's not meet again.
I've been very lucky thus far in my life that I've been in very few horrifying or scary situations. I'm pretty smart, and I tend to avoid situations where trouble could potentially arise. Though from time to time I'll try and provoke the universe into throwing something thrilling my way by going on random adventures or seeking out abandoned places. And each time I end up coming out unharmed and disappointed. There's one time, though, that I did get trapped in a horrible situation, though it wasn't on purpose. This happened purely by accident, but it's the only time I can ever think back where my life was legitimately in danger. I get chills all over my body every time I think about it. Luckily, I've pushed it back into the recesses of my memory and only bring it up every once in a blue moon to tell a scary story, such as now. I used to live in a small town in southern Kentucky, where I attended college. I had moved in with my boyfriend, which was also my very first relationship. Things ended pretty sourly, and we were forced to live together for about a month while I waited for my parents to help me move back home. I was pretty bitter about the breakup, given our relationship had lasted almost 3 years, and I had started to spiral in those last few months that I lived there. I overindulged in alcohol and weed and kept myself pretty doped up a good portion of that last month. I hated that I was leaving, as I had made several really good friends there, and I loved small town life. I was going to miss it when I moved back to the big city. I never got my full license after I got my driver's permit, so I didn't have a car. My ex did, and so I was entirely dependent on him for rides, which he stopped giving me after we broke up. I don't blame him, to be honest, but I felt like it was the least he could do after all the stuff he'd put me through. I thankfully still had a bike and resorted to biking myself all over town whenever I wanted to go somewhere. I loved biking, and thankfully this experience did not ruin biking for me. On the day the incident occurred, I was biking to campus to register for the current semester. Since I was moving back home, I would be registering for online classes for the first time. I still had to go in person and fill out too much paperwork and attend a couple of meetings, though. On this particular day, it was scorching hot, with the heat index well over 100 degrees Fahrenheit. I had a bottle of water with me, but it wasn't doing much good. The trip was longer than I usually biked, and I was completely soaked in sweat by the time I arrived on campus. As I was heading there, I saw a white van parked on the side street. There was lettering on the van, but I couldn't make out what it said. The driver was sitting in the driver's seat and looked up at me as I passed him. He was an older man with a gray beard. I couldn't see much else about him, but as I passed him on my bike, I saw that he was staring right at me. I thought nothing of it at the time, other than it being a little creepy. I'm naturally paranoid, so I glanced back when I was a couple of blocks away to see if he was following me, but he wasn't. When I got to campus, I tried my best to dry myself off in the bathroom, but my hair and clothes were still wet. I sat in the back of the auditorium and tried my best to pay attention to the meeting, but my thoughts kept creeping back to my now ex-boyfriend and our failed 3-year relationship. This wasn't the first time my heart had been broken, and I was actually planning to do this for several weeks. Everything about my life had fallen into chaos, and I was scared to go back home and start from scratch. More than scared, though, I was pissed, mostly at myself. I felt like I had thrown away 3 years of my life, and I hated it. I hated myself for being stupid, for not breaking up with him sooner, for not doing better in school, for so many mistakes that I'll never be able to go back and correct. I'm telling you this not because I want your sympathy, but just so you can understand my frame of mind during this incident. The meeting adjourned, and I went down the hall to speak with my advisor. She was nice and spunky, and we talked about my interests and hobbies and selected a good batch of classes that would be easy for me to do online, but still be useful for my degree. It was a relatively stress-free school registration, and the only thing I was dreading at that point was biking back home. My ex had to work and wouldn't be there, thankfully, but the long ride back was going to be even worse this time, as it had gotten even hotter. As I began to pedal back to my apartment, my thoughts returned to my ex. I hated that I couldn't stop thinking about him and our whole crappy situation. I started pedaling faster, wanting to get home so I could just smoke and watch something on Netflix and forget about the whole thing. Disillusionment and detachment were second nature to me now, and it was the only way I could cope with the situation. I passed this old train car museum near town square, which signaled to me that I was almost back. The heat was sweltering at this point, and little streams of sweat were practically pouring down my face. It was getting difficult to pay attention to the road, as I was now constantly wiping sweat off my forehead. A bump in the sidewalk was coming up, and I noticed it too late. As my bike tried to wheel over the bump, the force quickly popped the tube in my tire, and in seconds the front wheel was completely flat. The jolt was so sudden that it almost threw me off the bike, and I managed to stop right before going headfirst into traffic. I started cursing at myself, and my head got hotter and hotter as I started swinging my backpack around in frustration. Some papers and other items flew out of my bag, and I chased after them. I stuffed everything back into my bag, crinkling up every single piece of paper in there, but I didn't care at that point. My fuming temper, combined with the near blackout temperatures, were causing me to sweat immensely. I could feel the heat rising in my head, so I gathered my bag and my bike and walked it across the street. Even though I was less than 8 blocks away from my apartment, it felt like miles in this heat. With everything else that had happened up until that point, I felt like the universe was playing a cruel joke on me. As I walked my bike across another block, I saw the white van again from earlier, driving down the street I was walking on. The same driver was still in the driver's seat, and as if he could sense me, he looked over and stared at me. I looked away this time and just kept my focus in front of me, thinking about the icy cool apartment that was waiting for me. As I crossed the street and the van passed me, I noticed out of the corner of my eye that the van was turning down a street I had just crossed. I kept walking and got up another block when I got a gut instinct telling me to turn around. I did, and I froze. The white van had circled back and was now slowly following me. If you knew anything about this area of town, you'd know that most of the streets are one-way streets, and it takes an effort to circle back around if you turn down the wrong one. The driver would have been driving really fast in order to turn around like that. As it got closer, I could finally make out the wording on the side of the van. It was a transportation service for a local senior living center. The tension in my neck eased a little when I saw this, and the van pulled up next to me as the driver rolled his window down. He told me he noticed my flat tire and asked if I needed a ride home. Now, you're going to judge me harshly for what I'm about to do, and to be honest, deservedly so. The first thing we learn as kids is not to trust strangers and to never get into a stranger's vehicle. As a kid, I had never been in a situation where a stranger or adult had tried to kidnap me or take me hostage in any way, and I felt at the time that I was too old to be the target of any creep or pedophile. My anger was clouding my judgment, and it was so hot, and I was so miserable that I just wanted to get home. And the prospect of not having to walk my bike the rest of the way home was enticing. So, against the advice of every single adult and parent I had ever met, I said yes to the driver's offer. He smiled, not in the usual happy kind of way, but in almost the same way someone smiles when they're about to eat a juicy steak dinner. He quickly hopped out of the van and helped me get my bike into the back compartment. It was a spacious van, and the inside was in good condition and smelled like it had been recently cleaned. We got my bike inside, and then we both got into the front of the van. The driver took off and headed down the road to my apartment. I pointed the vent directly at me and got an Arctic blast of cold air right in my face. I immediately forgot all my hesitation and doubt, feeling as if I had made the right choice. I had my right hand on the door, just in case I needed to run, though. Now, many of you probably think this is where the story takes its dark turn, and it does, but not in the way you might think. He didn't start driving down the road away from my apartment or take out a gun and pistol whip me. He turned down the street I pointed to and drove into my apartment lot. He pulled into a parking space, and I noticed this was the space directly in front of my second-story apartment. I hadn't told him what building was mine yet, so the fact that he had randomly picked the right one was weird and freaked me out a little. I turned to the driver and saw that he was smiling at me like he was earlier, and that creeped me out even more. Despite this, or maybe because of this, I thanked him for the ride. I told him that I was having a really bad week and that it was a treat to get help from a kind stranger. His smile quickly faded, and for some reason that deeply unnerved me. Then he spoke up. "Don't thank me too much." A cold chill swept over my entire body as soon as he said that. I asked him what he meant, and he paused for a moment, and I could see his eyes running all over my body, as if he was inspecting me. I felt violated. I don't know why I didn't open the door at that moment, but I was so taken aback by his behavior, I guess I froze up. It was at this moment that I finally got a good look at him. He was wearing a dingy red shirt with the sleeves cut off, torn basketball shorts and flip-flops, not at all the attire I would expect a professional driver to be wearing. His face was worn with age, and I could see that he was a rather skinny man, but he had this crazed look in his eyes, and I feared that he could be capable of anything. He spoke up again. "Well, aren't you going to invite me upstairs so I can get a better view?" He spoke with a seductive but at the same time almost aggressive tone. At the same time he spoke, I heard a click, and I could feel the doors locking. Another, more powerful chill washed over me as every hair on my body started to stand up. I tried to jiggle the handle I was still holding on to and confirm that the doors were locked. A primal fear had completely overtaken me. I had no idea what he was going to do next. I looked around for someone, anyone, who might have been outside, and luckily I saw someone throwing away their trash. The dumpsters were on the other side of the lot, though, and I was afraid if I tried yelling or making a scene, the driver would pull out some kind of weapon and try to sedate me. I looked back over at him and saw that he was smiling that creepy, salivating grin. I looked deeper into his eyes, and instantly, a horrible realization came over me. He's enjoying this, toying with me, and he was relishing in it. I saw him turn around and begin to reach for something in the back seat. At the same time, I could feel my phone start vibrating. I had turned the ringer off during the meeting at school, but I could tell by the vibrations that it was a phone call. I pulled my phone out quickly and saw it was an unknown number. Seeing an opportunity, I quickly answered it. I almost shouted out loud when I heard it was an automated call concerning a debt I owed. I spoke nervously into the phone. Hey, Mom, what's up?" As I spoke, the driver looked back at me, dropping whatever it was that he had been reaching for in the back seat. He looked furious, almost as if he was about to rip the phone out of my hands. He didn't, though, and I knew that this was going to be my only chance to get out of that van. "I'm here, actually. Just about to walk up. Yeah, my bike got a flat tire, but someone gave me a lift home. Yeah, I'll be up in a few seconds." I hung up and looked over at him, laughing nervously. He was still staring at me, his face full of a heated rage. The air in the car was already pretty chilly, and with the shivers and goosebumps spreading all over my body, I felt like I was going to freeze to death. "Sorry, but I gotta get going," I said sheepishly. The driver didn't move an inch. He just kept staring at me. His eyes were piercing right through mine, and I suppressed a powerful urge to throw up. Could you please unlock the door?" I said weakly, practically begging at this point. He looked at me for a few more seconds, his eyes running over my whole body once more. He then smiled creepily at me once again. He was enjoying every second of this, and for a split moment, I felt like he had called my bluff about the phone call. I said a quick prayer to myself and prepared myself mentally for the fight of my life. To my surprise, though, he lifted his hand to his control panel and I heard the doors unlock. He kept his eyes on mine the entire time. "That's too bad. Maybe next time," he said. "Yeah, maybe," I spat out as I opened the door with an insane amount of force. That suffocating heat came flooding into the car, but I barely even registered it. I was practically euphoric now that I was out of that van, and I raced to the back of the van to get my bike out. When I turned around the passenger side, I gasped when I saw that the driver was already there. He had gotten there impossibly fast without making a noise. His entire demeanor was deeply unsettling, and I just wanted to be as far away from him as possible. He towered over me and silently opened the van's back door and helped me load my bike out. I thanked him again briefly before walking as fast as I could away from the van. I walked to the building opposite mine, as I was afraid of him potentially seeing which unit I lived in. When I got to the stairs and looked back, I saw that he was indeed staring at me. I left my bike behind the stairs and then started walking around to the back of that building. I was not about to let him see which apartment I went into. I turned the corner and walked to the back side of the building. There was a breezeway that intersected the entrances to the apartment that led out to the stairs in the parking lot. I stopped at the entrance to the breezeway, too scared to peek around the corner. I finally summoned up the courage and poked my head out, just enough to see the lot. I could see the van still parked in the same spot, but the driver was gone. Suddenly, the van began moving. As it backed out of the spot, I could see the driver behind the wheel. I was too far away to completely see his face, but I watched him intently as he slowly drove out of the parking lot. He didn't look over, and as far as I knew, he hadn't spotted me. As the van drove away, I made a disturbing observation that hadn't registered with me before. The van didn't have any windows in the back or on the sides, just the front. I had never seen a shuttle van without windows before. The black wording on the side of the van was faded, and there weren't any logos or unique symbols at all, just the title of the Senior Living Center in a plain font. As I pored over this, I walked over to my bike and peeked out from the breezeway at the lot. Once I was sure the van was gone, I walked my bike back across the lot to my building. I locked the bike into the stairs and walked up to my floor. I took one more look out at the parking lot to make sure I was safe before heading in. I locked the door, put the chain on, walked over to the sofa, and slammed my body down, overwhelmed and both mentally and physically exhausted from the incident. As I sat on my sofa and thought about the van, another, even more unnerving thought came to me. The back of the van had smelled like it had been recently cleaned. There was that fresh scent of cleaner in the air, and the dirt pans on the floor had been completely clear. The myriad of scenarios and what this could have meant flooded through my head. What's worse is I hadn't seen what he'd been reaching for in the back seat right before my phone rang and probably saved my life. There was something deeply wrong with that man, and chills began to spread all over my body, just from the thought of him. Now incredibly paranoid, I walked over to the window and peered out the blinds. There was no one outside now, and no cars were moving. It was eerily still, though, and with the sun starting to slip behind the clouds, the whole scene just looked like something out of a horror movie. When my ex came home, I told him about what happened. He took it seriously at first, before laughing in my face and telling me I wasn't going to last 5 minutes without him. He then went to his room and I cursed him under my breath. I left town a few weeks after that incident, and I never saw the man or that van again. To this day, I still have no idea what he'd been reaching for in the back seat and what his intentions were with me. And it's the not knowing that scares me the most. The windowless van, the freshly cleaned interior, and the mysterious object in his car that I didn't see. It all painted a very bad picture in my head. And whenever I started to go into the more extreme possibilities, the goosebumps would steer me away from those trains of thought. I didn't want to think about what that man could have done with me if he had gotten his way. Part of me wants to believe he was just messing with me the entire time. I still go out biking all the time to this day, even in the dead of summer, but now I'm much more cautious of my surroundings. And when I listen to music, I keep one earbud out so I can still hear if something approaches me. My advice to anyone listening to this story: stay aware of your surroundings. But most importantly, please heed the warnings of your parents and never get into a vehicle with a random stranger, no matter how tempting it may be, because you never know where they might take you or what they might do to you.
I always used to walk 4 blocks to school and back. Simple. Sometimes I liked to stop by my local park, which would be the 2nd block, and swing for a bit before carrying on. It was easy, didn't bother anyone, nor did it bother me, at first. Cut to a few months ago. I was walking down the 1st block, and 2 grown men stopped me at the bus stop that they were waiting on. One smiled creepily at me and reached out, wanting me to fist bump them. I did so to be polite. The other merely asked if I spoke Spanish, to which I said no, but then the first man got up, and it appeared that he was going to advance towards me. I immediately panicked and went into fight or flight mode. He didn't do anything, just walked past me. I relaxed and continued on my way to school. It wasn't until the man who fist bumped me, Mark, started catcalling me in Spanish. I didn't know what exactly he was saying, but I knew he was making remarks about my butt. Not to mention Mark looked about 50 to 60 years old, and he was making inappropriate remarks about an underage minor of 17. I arrived at school safely and informed my teacher quickly about it. I haven't encountered him since, until a few days ago. I was at the park again, and decided to head home early. It was Halloween, so I knew the weirdos would be out and about soon. My city isn't the safest, and it's the 2nd place of having the highest crime rate. I was waiting for the stoplight to go green so that I could cross to the 1st block, which would be where I lived, of course. Then my heart sunk when I realized who was roaming across from me. Mark. At first I wasn't completely sure if the 2 incidents were months apart, but I could easily recognize his face, and I knew he remembered mine too. I had no choice but to cross if I wanted to get home, as it would be the quickest way possible. My anxiety flared up when I saw him grin widely at me and let out a maniacal laugh. He tried pinning me against the hedge, which would honestly be super pointless as I could jump over and get away if I needed to. My fight or flight kicked in when he tried reaching for my shoulder, and I ducked and ran quickly home, immediately informing my mother about it. I haven't been to school for a week due to it, and because my mum refuses to let me walk alone anymore. What makes this incident even more scary is that there have been increasing reports of human trafficking, which makes me fear what could have happened if I hadn't have gotten away. So Mark, if you do read this, let's never meet again.
This happened last summer in a mid-sized town. I'd skipped my morning run that day, so I waited until the sun had started to dip behind the hills so it wouldn't be scorching hot. This is the first time I'd gone running in the evening, and I set out on a shorter route. Dusk falls at 10 p.m. this time of year, and it wasn't even 9 yet. Nothing seemed off, though the sort of people still outside were of a different lifestyle than those I usually saw in the morning. Instead of commuters with coffee in hand, children headed to summer camp, and elderly folk tending to their gardens. There were mostly 20-somethings, smoking on their porches, and teenagers coming and going. I head down a fairly quiet residential street that I don't usually frequent to cut across to the last leg of my normal route. I always run with my dog. He's part Staffordshire Terrier with a short coat, and most people assume he's a pit mix. Strangers tend to be a little intimidated by his physique and his bark, so I felt pretty safe. As I turn onto the road, I hear a car behind me, but think little of it. Then I realize it's been behind me for at least 4 blocks, so I make a quick glance over my shoulder. There's a beat-up burgundy sedan inching along. I'm used to drivers slowing down and catcalling me, but historically, if I ignore them, they drive off. Just as I'm hoping that this person is looking for a house and will pull up into a driveway or along the curb, the car rolls parallel to me, brakes whining, and slows to match my running pace. I maintain my speed and look straight ahead, but my dog has started to pull on the leash. "Hey, what's up?" A male voice calls out from the car. I ignore it. "Hey, beautiful, what's going on?" He tries again after 30 seconds. No one in a vehicle has persisted like this before, so I tell him the first thing I can think of. "Look, I'm married," I say audibly. This oftentimes works when I'm normally being hit on, yet my words seem to have no effect. From my sideward glance, he looks about 30 with greasy, unkempt hair and a skinny frame. "So what's going on?" he asks again. So I repeat myself. "Dude, I'm married," I project, this time looking up. My dog is growling softly and his hackles are up, but this guy doesn't seem to notice. "Hey, haven't I seen you? Aren't you the girl who likes to hang out at that park and smoke?" At this point, I'm irritated and looking around to see if anyone else is nearby. "No, you have the wrong person," I say calmly as my pace slows. "You are just so beautiful," he says, leering. "Look," I stop and stare at him. "I'm married and I'm not interested." I hold up my hand to display my ring. Could I have been any more clear? My dog is now growling at the noise level that I'm talking, but this creep isn't fazed. Trying to be as discreet as possible, I strain to catch a glimpse of his plates, but he stays parallel, so neither ends of his rusty car are visible. "Oh, well, tell your husband he's a lucky man." Finally, I got through to him. Good. I relax a little, all too soon. I start walking. After a few moments of silence, he says, "Well, can I at least watch you?" Now, the feeling of being creeped on is overwhelming my annoyance. No one has ever asked to watch me. I don't know what to say. He's still following me, brakes squealing lightly. At this point, I'm not sure what to do. It's still over a half mile back home and there's nowhere to go and no one around. I don't have my phone. He continues to follow me for another block. We're at the end of the street. A shadowy corner is lined with overgrown hedges and thick tree limbs that form a canopy. Suddenly, I spot a tall, burly man watching us from a porch darkened by dense foliage. He stands up and comes into the light. The car creep sees him, and I witness a short stare down. The man on the porch shifts his stance, and instantly the grease ball in the car speeds off. Because of the hedges in front of me, I can't see the license plates. I can hear him revving down the road. "Thank you," I say to the standing man, who nods lightly in recognition and sits back down. My dog stops growling. I continue walking and see taillights disappearing down the hill. I run home, taking every possible shortcut, being sure I'm not followed. The adrenaline wears off as I recount the tale to my housemate and my husband. It would have been very difficult to lose the guy, and I'd have had no choice but to lead him back to my house if that man hadn't done what he did. I'm grateful to the man on the porch for scaring him off. It's deeply unnerving when someone is so confident about creepily watching you. I reported the guy and never saw him again. That was the last time I went running in the evening alone, and now I always carry my phone with me. So let's never meet, greasy guy who wanted to watch me. I don't care to know what else you wanted to do. Hey everyone, it's Raven from Raven Reads, and I want to thank you for listening to tonight's stories. If you like what you hear, be sure to hit the like button. And while you're at it, don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell here on Mort's channel so you never miss an opportunity to let the darkness take control. If you enjoyed my narrations, you can click the link in the video description to head on over to my channel. The video link included will take you to a Skinwalker video I recently made. Feel free to browse around while you're there. I make horror narration videos like the one you heard tonight, and I also narrate original stories, creepypastas, and classic tales of terror. Every once in a while we discuss lore and haunted history as well. If that's something you're into, head on over to my channel, subscribe, and hit the bell, and you'll be an official member of the Conspiracy of Ravens. I post videos several times a week, and I'd love to have you with us on our next journey into the night. Thanks again for listening. My sincere thanks to Mort for having me back on the channel, and I hope you all have a pleasant evening. Bye for now.